Now look at verse 14. So Abraham, well, let's look at verse 13. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Verse 14. So Abraham called that place Yahweh-Yireh, which means the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on this mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Look at that last sentence. On this mountain of the Lord it will be. Notice that future tense. It will be provided. Now, what's so astounding about that is when we look at the parallels of this story and the story of Jesus Christ and his crucifixion, through this story we learn something more about what was happening on the cross. Notice back at verse 1, take your only son whom you love. John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world that he gave his what? Only son, only begotten son. Okay, so we begin to see a parallel here. Look at verse number 6 of Genesis 22. Abraham placed the wood on Isaac's back. Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice up the hill of Moriah. Who carried Jesus' cross up the hill? Himself, didn't he? The cross was the wood for his own sacrifice. And Jesus, God's Son, took it up the hill. The parallels get even more astounding when we realize where Mount Moriah is. Today, Mount Moriah is the place where the Dome of the Rock is situated, which is the third most holy site and to the Islamic religion. However, it was the original site of Solomon's temple. We'll talk all about that later on. But here's the astounding part. Mount Moriah really is not just one area. It's sort of it's not just one mountain top. It's an area. And one of the areas that adjoins Mount Moriah is another place called Golgotha, or the place of the skull, or Mount Calvary. So essentially Mount Calvary, where Jesus was crucified, and Mount Moriah are essentially one in the same area. Now, let's think about this just a moment. So Abraham the father was going to sacrifice his one and only son on Mount Moriah. He was willing to do that because he trusted. He placed the wood on his son's back and said, son, you carry the wood for, of course he didn't tell him this, but for your own sacrifice, you carry the wood up. When he got up to the top of the mountain, he laid the wood down, and of course he bound him and was going to take his life. The angel of the Lord stopped his hand. And then it said, on this place, on this mountain, it will be provided. In other words, it wasn't time for someone to sacrifice his one and only son. But one day, when it came time for that to happen, it would happen on that very spot. And God himself would sacrifice his only begotten son. God didn't stay his own hand when it came time. We begin to get a gruesome picture here now. And I warn you, it's not pretty. But if you saw the Passion of the Christ, that wasn't pretty either. If we look at the cross through this story, we begin to understand the age-old question, who crucified Jesus? Well, was it the Romans? Well, no, not really. They were agents. Was it the Jews? Well, no, not really. They were agents. Then who was it that was taking the life of this perfect man? According to this story, which becomes a type of Christ, it's clear who took the life of Jesus Christ. It was the Father. The Father was willing to give his one and only Son and to have him sacrificed so that this promise and this covenant might be realized to you and me.